Hello, everyone. My name is Lorri Hunt, and I'm a lead auditor certified by Exemplar Global that also serves as a representative to ISO 9001-2015 as a convener. I've been working with management system standards since the mid-90s and use the lessons I've learned in my working history to develop best business practices for internal auditing and third-party auditing. Today I'm going to be talking about auditing in a technology world. One of the things that is important to realize as we look at all of the different aspects of technology is that the world's changed. And as the world has changed, technology has changed as well. And one of the things that is becoming a little bit more noticeable in the working world is that the methods in which we audit in a technology world are not always keeping pace with those changes. So what I would like to do during this webinar today is to discuss some of the ways technology has evolved and how we as auditors can take knowledge and make us better auditors through our sample plans by looking at different ways to audit. So most of the auditing and work I do is with ISO 9001. But what we're going to discuss today is relevant to any kind of management system standard or any method in which we would be auditing. But if you think back into the time frame of when some of the first standards were developed, the technology that existed for doing the way we worked in our organizations was so rudimentary to where we are today. There were some computers, but not many. You had some VHS. We had pagers for maybe receiving a call, and very limited methods for actually going out and getting telephone calls, let alone a text message. And then if you looked at the next evolution really of technology, which would have happened around 94, many documented procedures, manuals, records were stacks of file folders that were on someone's desk or in a file room. And most of the presentations and the things that we did were done with overhead projectors and overhead slides, as opposed to projectors and Wi-Fi and linking to other technology that exists there. So when you look at all that and where we have come today, it's very interesting to see the advances in technology since 9001 first came out. We all know that the internet is one of those things that are out there. We've got Wi-Fi, email. We now use tablets in the workplace or to communicate. Digital cameras, collaborative workspace, and even the way this technology is working with the webinar that you're attending today. You're attending a virtual learning session at the leisure at your own desk when you have time to look at something online on demand. The world we look at has changed a lot. So when we look at the advances that we've made in technology, it's important for us as auditors or quality professionals to think about those areas of the business where we can change the way that we audit in order to add value to the audit process. And there's a lot of areas, and each organization is going to vary on what those areas are. But what we're going to focus on today are just a few of the different areas where we can add value by the way we sample data when we're looking at technology in an organization. And those can include management review, documented information, and some of the processes related to an enterprise resource planning system, which could include some of the purchasing aspects and some of the engineering information that is related to an online system. So when we're looking at auditing and technology, what is the items, or how do we think about the different areas of the organization? It's important for us to realize that the organizations and how we work, the focus remains on the output of technology versus the input of the technology. And what I mean by that is that we, as auditors or even quality professionals, say, well, the system's been populated with data, so it must be right. So it could relate to things for a demand that comes from an ERP system that runs every morning that tells you what parts need to be purchased. It could be the bill of materials that an operator is using in a production floor. It could be a training schedule. There's a lot of different ways and aspects of how information comes into play and how we actually audit it. And so to get there, we have to look at new technology or new methods for how we actually conduct those audits. And we want to make sure that we focus on where the data came from, the input as opposed to just the output of the data. And if you look at reasons why someone might be reluctant to change their methods, it's just very simple. When you're not familiar with the technology that you're auditing, it makes it very difficult to determine if the data is valid, or you might feel uncomfortable challenging technology in a certain system. That's somewhat the fear of the unknown. And you know, why create an additional work? Why are we, you know, why would I want to go out and change the way I audit when auditing already is an added assignment? You know, in most organizations, there's not the luxury of auditing being a part of a full-time job. It's a part-time aspect to the organization. So that reluctance to change can really cause organizations to not really change the way they do it. And even third-party auditors, you know, if you have a certification body auditor, you'll frequently see them sample very similar methods every single time. And it's important, if you're the third-party auditor, to remember to challenge yourself and think about, how am I going to audit to add value to the organization? And one of the ways that we can think about it before we even get into talking about the technology in examples of how it works together is looking at risk-based thinking. You know, what's the risk with a certain process, and what's the risk if this data input that's being managed through the technology is not correct? And, you know, based on that risk, you have to consider, is there a high risk to this? Is it potentially going to provide cause me to have a non-conforming output, whether it be a product or service? Or is there a low risk to this data? And based on that, we would determine what that impact to the organization is and develop a prioritization and include that in the audit plan and think about those aspects of it. And you know, I come from an organization that was very large in industry. And when we looked at those audit plans and doing those prioritizations, it really allowed us to add additional value to the organization. And as we go through this, I'll give some examples of, you know, what an audit sample would have looked like back in the mid-90s versus what that audit sample looks like in today's environment. So let's think about changing the way we do internal audits based on technology. So when we look at the sources of data and what we're going to talk about today, there's lots of different technology sources, databases, documented information. We're ultimately looking to provide customer satisfaction in our environment. So the first example where we're going to talk about how management review and technology, and even some of this may be a little bit about just changing the way in which we interact with management in addition to the technology. So if we look at the way management review would have been conducted back in the 80s, 90s, some organizations probably into the early 2000s timeframe would have been using an overhead projector and a screen and flipping slides. And in today's environment, the new way of working is an interactive, engaged leadership team that really looks at interactive data that exists. And so if we look at the methods for how that interaction works, in a typical management review, and in the past we would have been looking at the slides, we would have been looking at a report, some kind of written information. And then in today's environment, especially if you're serving as a third-party auditor and probably to some extent if you're an internal auditor, if you go into management and if you were going to say, hey, we're modernizing the way we look at management review, and we say, we want to know where's this data that you're presenting comes from? Who analyzes it? Is it, is it what I would call clean data, or is there some level of manipulation that's done because of the way the data pulls from an electronic system? And the reason that's important to think about is that if management is using data to make decisions about where they need to take action to make improvements to their organization, it's important for them to know that data, that there's confidence with that data. Now, if I were the internal auditor, would I go in there every single time and challenge it every single time? No, but it's a good piece of information or a good method to bring into your portfolio of ways to sample data. Because otherwise you're just looking at it and you're saying, okay, this data looks good. You could also take a different approach to that, and you could see if there were outputs of processes that maybe did not agree with what the data is presenting. So you might say, well, I understand this is what the management review data or the quality objective data said, but the output of this particular process is not in alignment with that. So that's a good way to take a different approach to how you align the data and how that fits together. When we look at documented information, that's probably one of the biggest areas where technology has a direct influence on the organization, and therefore the way we audit has to be looked at differently. And when I look at documented information, if you had a hard disk, it was, where you might have stored a few documents, but you were still probably printing everything out in those binders or in some kind of a paper form. And in today's environment, we have a cloud, and all of our technology and all of our data is in most cases is linking up to this cloud, and it's being provided in that particular method. So when we look at those particular styles and how we audit and engage with the process, I think it's important for us to realize that we definitely need to look at those particular aspects of the organization differently than what we would have in the past. So in the past environment and how we audited, we would have been, in most cases, looking at what's the current version of a document? Does that match what's on a master list or what's on the online version? And that's a great method to do it. I mean, it's a good method to do even in today's working environment, whether it be a drawing, a form, a documented procedure, some kind of specification. But there's lots of different ways to consider how that works together. In today's environment, most of the documents are not a formal signed-off approval, so it's important for us to take into consideration what's the workflow process. Nothing in most standards say you have to have a signed procedure, signed meaning signature. And so when you're looking at a name on a document, and as an internal auditor, looking at the way that that approval works. What's the workflow? Is that workflow being followed? Are the authorizations identified in the workflow system that's been chosen by the organization? And if that's the case, then making sure that that information is controlled and meets any necessary requirements. And as an auditor, you probably also need to be looking at whatever methods the organization is using to share information. Now, if you go back to some of the early versions of management system standards, we always talked about providing information in a verbal format. And when we look at verbal formats, it was like you could not take verbal information. And the new verbal information is now very informal, documented information. So you might see documented information and requirements being provided in a text message, an email, or even like a chatting function such as WhatsApp, Instant Messenger. All of those things are important to think about. And what you have to realize is that with some of those methods of communication, which definitely provide value to the organization, if they're providing requirements to an organization that at some other point need to be verified, if someone's telling someone, giving them a change to a specification that's not written down in any other format and that chat goes away, there's no documented information. So when you're sampling and you're doing your audits, talk about different ways that organizations are communicating with one another. And when we're looking at modernizing and looking at documented information from a modernization standpoint, the other thing to think about is the protection of documented information, what we would call records, objective evidence. Those things are very, very important to the organization, and keeping things in track and on track with those. And probably most important is the aspect of backups of data. And when you're looking at clouds and different ways of backing up the data, number one, you should be going to a server room and making sure the backups are being done. If the backups are being done from a remote storage or a vendor or a supplier of a service to provide that backup for you, then you also need to make sure that there's evidence of those backups are being done. Because if you're not verifying that information as an internal auditor, you're not looking at that protection aspect that's very important to the organization. So at a minimum, you should be seeing if the organization's doing those checks and then making sure that those are taken care of. If you're part of a bigger corporation and the headquarters has responsible for the documented information, make sure you know what kind of backup systems they have in place and that those are being done properly. And if someone else has responsibility or you have responsibility as an internal auditor, ask when was the last time they conducted a restore process or actually went through the process of verifying that they could retrieve the information if they needed to do so. So documented information is very much an important aspect of conducting internal audits and adding that additional value by modernizing the way that we look at it from a technology standpoint. And the other aspect is to really look at transitioning from looking at a version of a document and seeing if it's correct. And that's a very important aspect of internal auditing or third-party auditing, but also looking to see that new method of communication is being controlled properly and that we have all of the proper data backups going on within the organization. And one of the last areas that I want to really focus on, and I've labeled this data sources. You could call it a lot of things. You could call it ERP planning. You could call it information. There's a lot of different ways that you could look at this particular aspect of internal auditing and modernizing the way we do things. So in the past, we would have had manual systems where data was input by an individual and retrieved by an individual. And now we have, ERP planning systems and a lot of different ways of incorporating information. There's lots of tools out there, SAP, whatever your organization has chosen to use, or as an internal auditor, what you might see when you're going to visit an organization. And when we look at those different data sources that exist out there, it's very important for us to think about, it's different than what it used to be. I indicated at the beginning of the session that I would share some history and how it used to work. So if you were ever audited in the 90s, someone would say, show me where this purchase order is. And it might take you 30 minutes to identify where that purchase order was, and then it might take you another 30 minutes to find where this approved supplier list was because it was all so manual. And now that information is almost always at the buyer or purchasing agent's fingertips. So you have all this additional time. So instead of saying, oh, we found it in 10 minutes, my audit is over, why not take that time, which is really probably an hour that was allotted to that, and really looking at different ways of how to audit the data that is the source of the purchasing information to add that value to the company. So we're going to walk through the example of purchasing information. So what we want to look at today is verify that the purchase order is was in the past, you would have had a purchase order. Someone would have said, I need you to buy 20 widgets from this raw material from this supplier. And in today's environment, the purchasing agent comes into the office at the beginning of the day, and in a lot of cases, they just have a demand list that says, I want, you to buy 20 widgets of this, 10 widgets of that, and different, the information just tells you what to buy. There's not anything where you go back and verify that anything other than the quantities are needed based on demands in your own organization. What's interesting is that data today and my experience shows that when you sometimes sample the data from a purchasing aspect differently, you find that there may be a disconnect between engineering changes and what is going on in the actual information in SAP. In fact, I had this conversation last week where someone said, well, it's an SAP, it must be correct. And in reality, there's many cases where an engineering change does not get communicated to the purchasing agent, so therefore they're looking at it from a standpoint of purchasing something to a wrong revision of a drawing. I've seen engineering changes be informal, and so therefore they're verbally communicating some of that to the supplier. So as an internal auditor or a third-party auditor, go in and take a look at how to pull the version that's on that purchase order that they're buying, and then go to engineering and say, is this really the current version of the part that you're purchasing? And it's been interesting as I've changed this approach. You hear folks say, well, this is an engineering information and it's in SAP, it has to be correct. But I think this is where we, as in an auditing profession, need to make sure that we're adding value, that we're not just taking everything at surface value. And that's where you start getting to some of the core of making improvements to an organization. This can also be the case with the bill of materials. In the past, you would have been in the production environment looking to see that the drawing and revision level matched what was on the bill of materials, and that's a great approach to doing internal auditing. But it's also taking that, if you want to modernize, taking that next step and looking at ways to verify that the change notice that is related to that drawing in the production environment really identifies all of the aspects of that engineering change notice. One of the things that I've seen recently is changes made on drawings that are noted on that drawing, but when you go back and look at the engineering change request, it's not actually there. So again, technology would tell you that that's the right drawing level and that everything's okay, but in reality, there's still different aspects and ways of sampling that data to add additional value to the organization. So when we're looking at technology and data, make sure you go beyond just validating the document information from the source, but really looking at to make sure the source is correct and that the source has been input into that technology-driven system correctly. Doing that will change the way that you're doing auditing, and it will help provide that additional value that every organization is looking from their audits. And so in summary, I would like just to kind of cap some of the things that we talked about. When you're making changes to auditing, and if you're serving as an internal auditor, be aware of those technology changes and make sure that you challenge yourself to incorporate different methods of how to sample data to bring that additional level of data. Go in depth. Don't assume because a report has been created from an electronic technology-driven system that everything in that report is correct. And then continue to challenge your own methods to make sure that you add value within your own organization. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's online Auditor Expo and wish you good luck in your internal auditing.